Welcome everyone to our member development series webinars. Today we are going to be talking about FDA engagement. Where does a patient organization fit in? I will be moderating today's webinar, and we will have presentations by Larry Bauer, who is the Senior Regulatory Drug Expert at Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara, and Julie Breneiser, the Executive Director of Gorlin Syndrome Alliance. So welcome everyone. And once again, I'll just remind you to put your questions in the box below, and we will get those at the end of the presentations. So Larry, I will pass it over to you and take it away.
Okay, thank you so much, Kelly. It's a pleasure to be here today with you all. I'll give just a brief introduction of myself. My name's Larry Bauer. As Kelly said, I work at the law firm of Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara, but I'm one of the few non-lawyers that works there. My background is actually that I started out as a registered nurse working in pediatrics at the Cleveland Clinic Foundation. So I started out working, this was back in the 80s, working with children with rare diseases. Eventually, I moved to the Washington, D.C. area and for a job at the National Institutes of Health, and I was involved in clinical research for 17 years at NIH. From NIH, I moved over to the Food and Drug Administration. I was a regulatory scientist there and one of the co-founders of the Rare Diseases Program within the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. This was a program that started in 2010. Dr. Ann Pariser and I kind of started the program together. And it was the first time that the FDA had a program totally devoted to rare diseases within the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. They'd already had the Orphan Products Group, the Office of Orphan Products Development, but we were the first group in CEDAR. And in that role, I did a lot of work with patient advocacy organizations, as well as we tried to educate FDA staff about rare diseases and rare disease drug development. We did a lot of work with some of the big umbrella organizations like NORD and the Every Life Foundation. But I really developed a passion for rare diseases, and I continue to this day working at Hyman Phelps, especially working to try to bring the patient voice into drug development. It's one of my main things that I work on. Okay, next slide, please. So a couple of the topics that I'll be speaking about today, I'll give you a little bit of a historical perspective on patient engagement, and then I'll talk about current opportunities for patient input at the FDA. A couple of these are things like externally led patient-focused drug development meetings or FDA listening sessions. And I'll talk a little bit about what is the impact of patient engagement on drug regulation and some about how we do this work. And then we're so fortunate to have Julie with us today. Julie and I have worked together on several big projects. So I'm going to kind of give you the background about it, and then Julie is going to really get into it to tell you how did her specific organization engage with the FDA and how did that go and how did they do it. So about 10 years ago, the FDA really made this commitment to engage with patient communities. They wanted to find out a way of, in a more systematic way of getting patient input into drug development. They said patients who live with the disease, they have a direct stake in the outcome of FDA's decisions, and they're in a unique position to contribute to the understanding of their disease. So then we say, well, who exactly are patient stakeholders? So this is a broad term. It includes patients, as well as family and other direct caregivers, because they are so involved, or especially when we're speaking about children, treating children, it's often the parents that we have to engage with to have input about the child's experience. And then also with organizations that represent them. So this is for what we're talking about today for rare disease patient advocacy organizations. Next slide. So a little bit about the history of patient engagement. So historically, drugs were developed by drug companies. They talked to physicians, maybe academics. They were always developed by scientists and drug companies without any input from patients. There was a turning point in the 1980s when the AIDS epidemic hit, And mostly young men were dying at alarming rates. And the AIDS activists demanded that their voices become included in the decision-making for drug development. They had a couple sit-ins at the FDA. They laid down and acted as if they were dead, and they just said that that the FDA's slowness in responding to the epidemic was actually killing people. So this led to the inclusion of patient representatives on FDA advisory committees, as well as creating the accelerated approval pathway. As you can see in the picture below, it says time isn't the only thing the FDA is killing, meaning that all these young people are dying. Next slide. So the thing that they came up with that they, as an experiment, was something called patient-focused drug development. This was developed out of the HIV experience in the 80s and the cancer experience in the 90s. It was based on the premise that patients and caregivers are the people that really understand their disease, and that patients are uniquely able to describe symptoms. So what is it that they experience with the disease, and what are the impact of these symptoms on their lives? Like how do they impact their lives, and which symptoms are most impactful? And also, patients and caregivers are the only ones that can really talk about the risks that they might be willing to take to use a new treatment. For example, with new HIV drugs, in the beginning, when there was nothing available, people were willing to take anything because the alternative was death within a very short period of time. Actually, as some drugs did begin to get approved, people were not as willing to take the same risks because there was something available. So, risk tolerance is a very dynamic thing that you can only find out from speaking to patients and caregivers. And patients really wanted to participate in the development of products that they eventually may be taking. Next slide. So this is just a schematic of opportunities for research sponsors to involve patient stakeholders. So if you look at the set of arrows in the center of this slide, it moves from left to right. The first light blue is pre-discovery. Then we move into preclinical, which is mostly studying animal models and things in the test tube. Then from preclinical, it moves into phase 1. Phase 1 in drug development is the first time a drug is given to a human being. You usually give it to a small number of people at first in order to see if there's any major safety issues. And then you move into something called phase 2 and phase 3, where you expand it. You give it to a larger number of people, especially people with the condition, to see if the drug is effective for the condition. You also continue to monitor safety data. And then the final step is sending all of the data from the clinical trials to the FDA for their review and eventual either approval or not approval. And then there's also outcomes in the post-marketing space. So some of this print is kind of hard to read a little bit, but some of the things patients can do is to help with funding some, clinical studies at the beginning. They can help in collecting natural history data, which is what is it like when this disease is not treated? How do people move from the first of, that they're diagnosed all the way through the lifespan? This gives very important information for drug development. They can give feedback on meaningful endpoints. So what type of an effect from the drug would be meaningful to them. They can review consent forms. Anytime someone gets involved in a clinical study, there has to be a consent, and patients should have input in developing that consent so that that it's understandable and that their thoughts are being taken into consideration. As you move along when you start recruiting for the study, patient advocacy organizations are invaluable, especially in rare diseases, to be able to contact their community, give people information about the study, and help with enrolling the study so it gets done as quickly as possible. Once again, the patients might have input on the study design. And let's see, yeah, and there's an ongoing process of monitoring the safety of a study. They put together something called a Data Safety Monitoring Board. This is a group of people that review any important safety effects that develop or arise during the course of a study. And patients and caregivers can become part of that Data Safety Monitoring Board. And then when we get to the point of reviewing the drug, patients can serve on the FDA Advisory Committee if there's going to be an advisory committee. They can provide testimony at FDA open hearings. Sometimes, there's an open time for an open microphone and patients come up and tell their story, and that feedback's very important to the FDA. Yeah, and then in the post-market state, after a drug is approved, patients, we hope that people will continue to give the FDA feedback on the types of side effects that they're experiencing, any issues with the drug, especially any serious side effects need to be reported to the FDA. Next slide. So a little bit about patient input in drug regulation. So the FDA reviews medical products on a case-by-case basis when it receives an application, a marketing application. This is either a new drug application for small molecules or biologics licensing application for things like gene therapies, vaccine, and blood products. Patient stakeholders can contribute to the regulatory decision-making in two ways. They can consult and advise on specific applications. So if there's a specific drug being developed, FDA has something called a patient representative program. This is good because it brings patient input. One of the drawbacks to the patient representative program is that usually it's just one person. So it's not a representation of the entire community. It's the opinions and ideas of one person. And as I mentioned earlier, too, when there's open public hearings at FDA advisory committees, people can contribute there. They can provide context that's applicable to all applications through patient-focused drug development meetings, as well as patient listening sessions and critical path innovation meetings. We'll talk about all these things in a little bit more detail. And they also provide input on patient engagement. There's something called the Patient Engagement Collaborative and the Patient Engagement Advisory Committee. And a little bit later, when you hear from Julie, she has a wonderful slide that kind of shows you and gives you an overview of all these different ways that patient communities can engage with the FDA. Next slide. So this schematic here is a little bit of the evolution of patient engagement at the FDA. It starts from the lower left and moves up to the right. So back in like the 1980s, we see the HIV/AIDS patient group was founded, the ACT UP, maybe some of you remember the group called ACT UP. It eventually expanded to include cancer and other special health issues. Eventually, the FDA established a health professional liaison program. The MedWatch program was developed so that there was a systematic way of collecting side effects from people using drugs. And then back in 2012 was when they first started talking about having patient-focused drug development meetings. Let's see, in 2015 was when the Patient Engagement Advisory Committee was launched. And and then back, like more recently in 2018, the FDA Patients Affairs staff established a memorandum of understanding with NORD. Next. So this is just a little bit more about the overview of some of the ways that FDA interacts with patients. So within the Office of the Commissioner, there's the Patient Affairs staff. This is a special group of people that it was an outgrowth of the Office of Special Health Issues. And prior to 2012, this was the only dedicated FDA patient engagement office. Within CDER, within the Center for Drugs, there's the Professional Affairs and Stakeholder Engagement Group, or PACE. This is a group of people that are devoted to, they provide some drug snapshot overviews that are very understandable for lay people, as well as work on different types of projects to engage with patient advocacy groups. The CEDAR developed the patient-focused drug development staff. This was a special group of people to help patient organizations when instead of having FDA-led patient-focused drug development meetings, they shifted to externally led patient-focused drug development meetings. These were meetings that patient advocacy organizations were running, but the FDA and the patient-focused drug development staff are there to support. Once again, Julie will be able to give you a little bit more details on what it was like to hold one of these externally led patient-focused drug development meetings. Then we have within the Center for Biologics, we have the Patient Engagement Program Team. And then in the Office of the Commissioner, we have the Advisory Committee Oversight and Management staff. And this is where patient representatives are recruited. Next slide. So, you know, sometimes the way things get done at the FDA is when new legislation is passed. And part of the 21st Century Cures Act, which was signed into law on December 13th, 2016, was a section in the rare disease portion of that bill that requires FDA to make public a brief statement regarding the patient experience data and related information, if any, submitted and reviewed as part of an approved NDA or BLA. So this could include information like data that were collected about the patient's experiences that had the specific disease or condition, including related to the impact of the disease on patients' lives and patients' preferences with respect to treatment. Information on patient-focused drug development tools like patient-reported outcomes and other information that FDA determines to be relevant. So from this point forward, anytime a drug company was submitting a new NDA or BLA package to the FDA, they were required, they continue to be required, to have a section that talks about how did we engage with the patient community as we develop this new drug. Did we have any kind of, review survey data from the patients? Were we involved, or did we support maybe them having a listening session with the FDA or a patient-focused drug development meeting with the FDA? And what did we learn from the patient community? And how did we incorporate that into our drug development plan? So the FDA, in order to have a complete application, the drug company must now officially address how they have worked with the patient community. So this is no longer something that you can choose to do or not do. It's actually a requirement by statute that every new drug that's being developed has to have patient and caregiver input. Next slide. So now a little bit more specifically about this patient-focused drug development initiative. As I said, it started in 2012. It's an assessment of a drug's benefits and risks, which involves an analysis of the severity of the condition and the current state of the treatment armamentarium. So actually, the drug's benefits and risks, that part of the information comes from the clinical trials, but the analysis of the condition, so what are the symptoms, what are the impacts on people's lives, and what are people, doing to try to treat the disease? That was how patient-focused drug development could contribute. And the reason is that, like I said it earlier, patients who live with the disease have a direct stake in the drug review process and are in a unique position to contribute to drug development. They're the experts, they're the clinical experts, and they know things about how a disease impacts their lives that unless you live with that disease or condition, you really do not understand. And patient input, they had generally relied on feedback from FDA advisory committee meetings, but this just wasn't enough. It was at the end of the process. It was kind of too late to really implement that feedback from patients. So this review process, this patient-focused drug development, they were meetings that the FDA held to have a more systematic approach to obtaining patient perspectives on disease severity and unmet medical needs by therapeutic area or disease area. So the next slide. So that it actually, once again, it got into the Prescription Drug User Fee Act 5, which included dedicated resources to try to expand activities to provide review divisions with patient input. So the FDA they convened about 24 meetings with stakeholders focused on specific disease areas. And I think there's been 6 more of these meetings that they've held since. Each meeting, some of them were for common diseases, some of them were for rare diseases. They reviewed available treatments for the indication and identified areas of unmet need. Participants included FDA review staff, the relevant patient advocacy community, and other interested parties. And FDA was mostly in listening mode at this meeting. So they would pose questions to the patient community, and then usually there was a panel of patients. And then we had people online that were calling in as well, and people would provide testimony about their experience. At the end of these meetings, they created a report called the Voice of the Patient Report. This document it was a summary of the meeting. What did we hear from patients and caregivers? And these documents live on the FDA website so that anyone can read them. And whenever a reviewer at the FDA, when they're going to review a new drug and there was a patient-focused drug development meeting, they can go back to the Voice of the Patient Report to learn and review what is it that patients and caregivers with this disease said. And that one of the big goals was to hear from as many patient stakeholder voices as possible to reflect greater representativeness. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes patient representatives, single people were involved, which gave like one perspective, but FDA really wanted to get a broader perspective from a group of people. And FDA could apply this input across all products for a particular disease. And it, like I said, it would help to inform them when they were trying to evaluate the benefits and risks of a new drug, and when they were trying to review the data, and make the decision whether to approve or not. Next slide. After doing this group of meetings, the FDA realized we cannot do this for every disease. They thought it was a very successful process. So they said, we're going to turn it over to the patient advocacy organizations to start organizing and leading these meetings. And so that's why they're called externally led patient-focused drug development meetings. This was an opportunity for patient groups to host these meetings. They're designed exactly the same way that the FDA designed their meetings. And as of October of this year, there so far has been about 65 of these externally led PFDD meetings. The first step is to submit a letter of intent to the FDA. They will review that and get back to you to see if they support the meeting. Because of COVID, these meetings have been held virtually, which has had some challenges, but it's also made them more accessible to people all over the country and all over the world. And just as for the meetings that the FDA did, they also create a Voice of the Patient report at the end of the meeting that are posted on the FDA website. Next slide. Another opportunity for patient input is something called patient listening sessions. These are meetings that help inform FDA staff of a disease and the treatment burden in a particular disease, and it can have either broad or narrow focus. Now, these are they're quite different from having a patient-focused drug development meeting. A patient-focused drug development meeting is usually an all-day meeting from like 10 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon. These meetings are shorter. They tend to be 60 to 90 minutes in length. They come from the Office of the Commissioner, and they reach out to the different centers to see who would like to participate from the FDA side to be in listening mode. And it's like I said, there's an opportunity to give the FDA some background on a disease, to hear from a small number of patients, and then to have an open question and answer period with the FDA. One of the big differences is a listening session is not a public meeting. So no one other than the FDA and the people who have planned the meeting are able to attend. So industry does not attend, and no family, external family members or anyone can participate. Where I work at Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara, we help coordinate these sessions. We help with the request for the meeting, preparation of the agenda and speakers. We coordinate with the Office of Patient Affairs, and we often moderate the discussion with patients and caregivers. Next slide. And one other type of meeting that I'd like to mention is the FDA Critical Path Innovation Meetings, or CPIM meetings. These were developed by the Center for Drugs to address technical issues in drug development meeting. It's not product specific, and unlike listening sessions, it can include regulated industry, academia, scientific consortia, advocacy organizations, and government. And the purpose is to discuss methods or technology proposed to enhance drug development. For instance, the topic might be natural history studies for a particular disease, clinical outcome assessments, or clinical trial designs. So they're usually focused on issues related to development of new products for a certain disease. Once again, where I work, we can help coordinate with these, with critical path meeting requests, developing the agenda and the briefing book, and we can help coordinate the discussion of questions with the FDA. Next slide. These are just a couple examples. You're going to hear from Julie in a minute about, in November of 2020, the Gorlin Syndrome Foundation had a listening session on the multi-system impacts of Gorlin syndrome. In March of 21, the Barth Syndrome Foundation on the tolerance for less certainty of treatment benefit. And then in July of 2021, Emily's entourage wanted to meet with the FDA to talk about the unmet need in the 10% of untreated cystic fibrosis patients. So there are treatments for people with CF, but there's still 10% that have nothing. A couple examples of critical path meetings. In 2020, the Lulu Foundation did one for CDKL5 deficiency disorder to look at the natural history study for trial design and outcome measures. And then in the next year, a group called LuMind, we had a meeting focused on Down syndrome that's associated with Alzheimer's disease. This was so interesting. I always learn things when I get involved in these projects. Like, I did not realize that as people with Down syndrome are living longer, they're developing Alzheimer's disease at an alarming rate. Next slide. So what does FDA do with this information? They, you can use any of these things to, when drug companies are submitting submissions to the FDA, sometimes they take quotes from these meetings. It can help the FDA to know how they should be more flexible when reviewing things for serious diseases with unmet needs. It really helps them to understand what's important to patients, so that when they're developing, what are the clinical outcomes that are going to be measured, how often are we going to measure them, and what's a clinically meaningful effect. And then it also lets the FDA know about risk tolerance. Next slide. So there's a series of guidances that, if you want to look any of these up, you can Google this: patient-focused drug development guidances, to give some more information. Next slide. And I want to thank you. And now I'd like to introduce my friend Julie Breneiser, who's going to share her experiences, and then we'll do the Q&A once we're all done.
Thanks. Excuse me. Thanks, Larry. And hi, everyone. I'm pleased that you're here today, whether you're watching live or watching the recording. So I'm Julie Breneiser, and I'm Executive Director of the Gorlin Syndrome Alliance. I have Gorlin syndrome, as do my almost 31 and 29-year-old children. And in previous life, I was a physician assistant for nearly 20 years, which has helped really in the medical background. What drives me to work is my kids. And These are some photos of them over the past few years. My daughter on the left is an avid mountain biker, and sometimes I think, why am I worrying about her getting a sun or protecting herself from the sun when she could ride her bike over the edge of this mountain, or any that she could crash on? Our son is a 4-time Ironman triathlon, and they have chosen to live their lives, and we've supported this, though I often am conflicted because I would love them to practice more sun-safe habits. At the same time, life goes on, and we all recognize that. Next slide, please. I'm going to do a quick review of Gorlin syndrome before I proceed. The incidence is 1 in 27 to 31,000, depending on who you read. It's an autosomal dominant genetic disorder, and about 31% of us get it from a spontaneous mutation. Autosomal dominant means that there's a 50-50 chance that each offspring will develop the disorder. Back in the end of 2019 and early 2020, we did a global survey of people with Gorlin syndrome. And we learned from that the average person over the prior 12 months lost 24.8 days of their lives to this syndrome. That was to appointments, procedures, recovery, time out of school, time out of all sorts of things. Gorlin syndrome can affect every organ system. The top 2 manifestations are basal cell carcinomas. Some of us have had over 1,000 in their lifetimes. I'm one of those people. And odontogenic keratocysts. These are cysts of the lower and upper jaw bones. They, as this says, have a high recurrence rate. They have to be treated very aggressively. And when I was a teenager and first diagnosed, I was told that they are benign tumors, but they are considered malignant in their recurrence rate. So again, they need to be treated very aggressively. And in a lot of our community, their development has led to the loss of permanent teeth, which may require implants and a lifelong dental issues. Other manifestations are listed there. You can read them as well as I can. Another life-impacting cancer in young children, 0 to 2, the medulloblastoma, hydrocephalus, which is extra fluid in the brain, and so on. We have no FDA-approved treatments for Gorlin syndrome, and we are considered never cancer-free and never in remission. Next slide, please. Here's some pictures of some people in our community. I'm not going to take the time to go through each and every one of them, but some difficult stories here, and including the fact that in the lower right, that photograph has a father and daughter. The father, in spite of being very fastidious about caring for his basal cell carcinomas, died of metastatic basal cells to the lungs. Now, the next set of the next collage has some pictures that the next 2 collages have some pictures that might be disturbing. So I just want to forewarn you if you have a queasy stomach. I know it's after lunch on the East Coast, but it might not be if people are watching on the West Coast. So next slide, please. These are some pictures of people with multiple basal cell carcinomas that are under treatment or have been treated. You can go on to the next slide. And these are some kiddos who have obviously a significant burden, skin cancer burden. I'll just speak briefly about the one in the center right on the top. That is a 9-year-old, and he, prior to being diagnosed with Gorlin syndrome, had a medulloblastoma that was treated with radiation therapy. All those dark spots are pigmented basal cell carcinomas, and any sort of ionizing radiation, along with UV radiation, UVA, UVB, will cause us to develop skin cancers. And when it's high dose radiation therapy, like it was to treat his malignant tumor, this is the result. Next slide, please. So in my mind, it's unreasonable for us to believe that the FDA, healthcare providers, or anyone other than affected individuals, families, and care partners will understand our burdens, or that these folks will understand the burdens of any rare disease. The vast majority of healthcare providers have never heard of rare diseases. Go ahead to the advance it once. We want them to be trained in the basic stuff, like how to, my analogy is that dogs are really common. But in the next slide, we're a zebra. Rare diseases are zebras. And so it's up to us, and you can advance it further. It's up to us as patients, as parents, and as advocates to teach the FDA, to teach healthcare providers, and anyone interested in our burdens and unmet needs. So now I'll talk a little bit about our experiences with the FDA. You can go on to the next slide. Part of the challenge here is that there is a huge knowledge gap. The FDA is huge. It's bureaucratic. It's intimidating. And it's important for us to understand that all of the work of the FDA is driven by laws, statutes, and codes that are written on Capitol Hill. Prior to approaching the FDA, you need to consider the goal of your communication. As a PA many years ago, I worked with a surgeon who would tell the residents in training and the interns, you've got to plan your work and then work your plan. So you can move on to the next slide. Here is a little bit more about the FDA. As I said, it's big and it's bureaucratic. And this is a lot of information in one slide, but if you look at the tree on the left side, third box in, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, or CDER, that is the division that new drugs are evaluated in. Obviously, there are a lot of other centers here and a lot of people. You can go on to the next slide, please. So we had sponsorship from pharmaceutical companies because in order to help us advance, well, in order to help pharmaceutical companies advance their therapies, we felt that they needed, that we needed to teach the FDA about Gorlin syndrome. So we, in early 2020, we wrote a letter of intent. As Larry mentioned, this was the first step to do an externally led patient-focused drug development meeting for the FDA. As I said, our goal was to treat them about Gorlin syndrome, our burdens and our unmet needs, and the positive impact of having FDA-approved treatments, what that would be on our community. Our letter to do the PFDD was initially accepted. Then they said, no, never mind. You can just do a listening session and we'll give you 60 minutes to do that. And I was like, wait a minute, guys, you've taken away a whole day for a PFDD. It's a whole day long meeting. And you've brought it down to 60 minutes. And you expect me to adequately inform you about a syndrome that can affect every organ system in 60 minutes. And so they said, all right, we'll give you 90. We were also told that as soon as this was completed, that they would support us in doing a PFDD. Part of the educational process here is that the listening sessions are run by one group in the FDA. PFDDs are run by another group. So we did our PFDD almost exactly 2 years ago. We had 42 representatives for this virtual meeting. And if we had been in person, I don't think that we would have had that many people. We were thrilled to have that many people there. We wrote a summary that was posted on the FDA's and the GSA's website, and those are listed here. And these slides are going to be made available by Kelly and the CSD so that you can reference them on your own. Next slide, please. So continuing on, we submitted again to do our EL-PFDD, and the date was chosen and planning began. And let me stop here just to say that once you decide to do this, it is a huge commitment. It's a commitment of time and money. And in my mind, it's very worth it. We decided to bring on Larry and others at Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara to help us do it. And in my mind, having them we couldn't have done it without them. And I could take a long time to discuss the pros and cons of using a consulting firm to help you. And we can do that at another time or in person at the AAD meeting. But just understand that if you decide to do this, it takes at least 6 months to plan and a lot of people's time during that time period. So you have to choose a medical expert or two to speak. You have to find affected individuals or care partners to speak. They and you have to write scripts, rehearse these things, send out invitations, on and on. It's a big process. And another critical part of it for us was developing. We did ours in a studio. You'll see pictures here shortly, but we had interactive multiple choice questions that we asked the attendees during the meeting, and deciding what impactful questions we wanted to be kind of in the face of the FDA with was very critical to our meeting. So go ahead, next slide. These are two of the questions that were asked, and I'll just focus on the second one because it's easier for everybody to read. And that was one that we considered quite a bit. Would a preventive treatment that reduces new basal cell carcinomas by 30% with no challenging side effects be an improvement on your current options? So what showed up immediately on the screen was 100% of the people who were parents, affected individuals, parents or affected individuals, 100% said yes. But ultimately, the statistics came back showing 94%. Well, still a huge number. And that's very impactful for FDA reviewers because they want to know what it means, what would be clinically meaningful to us, what would impact how the words they use are how you feel, function, and survive. So for somebody, let's say somebody's on the track to develop 1,000 BCCs in their lifetime, a reduction in 30% is a big reduction. Next slide, please. So our PFDD took place virtually on October 8th. We had a great audience, 268 people, 37 from the FDA, as well as affected parents, grandparents, widows, friends, pharma research, and other stakeholders. And ahead of time, I sent emails personally to a lot of people from the FDA who I knew had been involved in dermatologic drug reviews, and I sent all the attendees a thank you note afterwards as well. We worked with a medical writer. I worked with a medical writer to create our Voice of the Patient report, and that's available, as Larry said, on the FDA's website and on our website. And this is important because reviewers look at these when they have a product that may potentially go to trial or is in trial. They look at the Voice of the Patient reports to decide to see whether this whatever the product is, would have an impact that would be meaningful to the patients. The pictures here are just on rehearsal day. On the left there, Larry and me in the studio, and then the control room is the picture on the right. Go ahead to the next slide. So those were our experiences as the GSA and overall. I've had a number of personal experiences as executive director of the GSA, and one when I was board president. And so that's what I wanted to review with you now. I've participated in pharma-sponsored meetings with the FDA as a patient and community representative to be there to support the work of the pharmaceutical company. I've met by attending meetings. Anytime I see somebody who's an FDA employee, I try to talk to them, to introduce myself and tell them about Gorlin syndrome and our burdens, our unmet needs. I've sent personal emails to people at the FDA, And in this slide, you can see the format of their emails. And this took me a while to figure out, and it has worked. As it says here, some were answered by the individuals, some by a representative, and others received no response. Another way to talk to the FDA is through the Patients Ask FDA portal, and that information is there. And back last fall, I applied to be on the Patient Engagement Collaborative, and this was a competitive application process, fairly long application, and I was asked to join and joined the group last November. The charge of the group is the formatting got messed up here a little bit. Oh, well, it's a group of patient organizations and individuals, representatives and individual representatives who discuss how to achieve more meaningful patient engagement in medical product development and other regulatory discussions. I've been in on 4 meetings now, I think. And so the work goes on. I applied earlier this year to speak at FDA's Rare Disease Day. I was granted 2 minutes, not 2 minutes and 5 seconds, but 2 minutes to talk. And so I thought ahead of time about what were the goals of what I wanted to say and put those into my exactly 2-minute, heavily rehearsed talk. And that involvement with FDA's Rare Disease Day led to some further conversations with Dr. Sandy Retzky, Director of the Orphan Product Development Section, and on the FDA's use of regulatory flexibility and other topics. Regulatory flexibility is something that I could go on and on about, but I'm happy to do so individually at another time. Go ahead on to the next slide. One of my contacts at the FDA shared this slide with me to share with all of you. And it's pretty self-explanatory. Upper left corner are the sections within the office of the commissioner. If you want to talk to those folks, the list is right there for you. Or if you want to send questions, that sort of thing. For the Center for Biologics is on the upper right quarter, Center for Drugs, bottom right, and Center for Devices, bottom left. So again, this came directly from the FDA and will be available to you in the slide deck that Kelly's going to share with everyone. Go ahead to the next slide. These are some other links that I dug up that might be useful for people about planning PFDDs and listening sessions and other types of meetings that you might have, as well as the Patient Engagement Collaborative. I've got to say the Patient Affairs staff is a small and mighty group of people who are very easy to talk to, and I encourage you to reach out to them if you need to, and use the Patient Ask FDA portal for specific questions. My experience there is to be determined. I've sent a number of questions and hope to hear back soon for answers. But I'm confident I will, because I know that they're working on it. Next slide, please. So take home points. Don't be afraid to ask questions, send emails, ask the FDA. Never lose sight of the goals of your community. Consider conducting a listening session and ELPFDD for your group. Pharma and other stakeholders may be interested in providing financial support, and remember to budget a significant amount of time for this project because it's huge. Get your toe in the door by asking questions like this. Apply to speak at the Rare Disease Day or other opportunities they have. And just don't be afraid to ask. It's critical to your future and that of your patient community. Next slide. That's all I've got. And thank you very much. Here's my email address is there. And these are a couple of cute pictures of cuties. The guy on the left is 3. He's got Gorlin syndrome. And the guy on the right is my son when he was about 2. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie and Larry. That was so much great information. Fantastic. I don't see any questions in the Q&A box. If any of you want to put some in there, please go ahead and do that. Otherwise, Larry and Julie will go back and forth a little bit with some questions. So while we're waiting for those, we've got a few more minutes to discuss. So Larry, Julie, do you want to pose some questions to one another?
Sure. Maybe a question for you, Julie. You're one of the rare groups that has both had a listening session at the FDA as well as an externally led patient-focused drug development meeting. Which one, how do you compare those as far as the amount of work it took to put together, and then as far as what you think that the outcome was?
The amount of work it took to do each one, as I said, was huge. Obviously, the PFDD prep and all that was much larger, but the impact is much greater because I'm quite sure that the voice of the patient report is something that is used by the FDA, the reviewers there, and others. I know that others are looking at it to see the burdens of our disease and our unmet needs. And I know that investors look at these for potential information on our disease, and reviewers really want to see it's their only source of information from the patient as to what might make a difference in our lives. So for us, and from talking to the FDA during the process, the listening session was a stepping stone to the PFDD, and it seems to be that that's the path that is sort of required at this point, though I don't know if that's consistent. So in terms of work, yes, the listening session was less, but I think in the long run, it's a long-term investment. We're going to get more out of the PFDD and the Voice of the Patient report. And what we chose to do with our Voice of the Patient report, pictures are worth 1,000 words. So there's a lot of words in our Voice of the Patient report, but there's also a photo gallery, and each is indexed separately so that if you want to just look at the pictures, you can do that. But it's divided out. And so that's another consideration depending on the disease and how impactful photographs you might have are.
Yeah, one thing from, excuse me, working with several groups, some groups only have listening sessions, some groups only have ELPFDD meetings, some groups have both. So it's can happen many different ways. But you made a good point, Julie, that the listening session, that the summary of it is not in the public domain. But because of that, I think that's a limitation. So one of the things when I'm working with groups that are doing listening sessions now, I'm encouraging them to write it up as a white paper, and then maybe even bring in more information than just the listening session, but to somehow write it up, get it published, so that even what happened at the listening session also is in the public domain, just to try to get the word out more.
That's a great idea. So we have two questions that came in, one from Susan Thornton with CLF. How can an organization prioritize and look at building this type of initiative into an overall strategic plan or operational initiative, given the amount of time, effort, and money, especially with a small organization with limited resources?
Well, that's a really good question, and it's hard to answer. I mean, we are a small organization with very limited resources. We, again, were able to get some nice funding for this from pharma because they want the FDA to understand our issues. So that allowed us to hire Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara to help with a lot of critical points here. And the intent of this session is not to be an advertisement for Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara. I just want people to understand that you can do it on your own and you can do it with a consultant. It was nice to be able to have them to take up some of the workload. So seeking funding to hire a consultant is worthwhile. And that's something that Susan, I can talk to anybody individually about it if they'd like. I'm happy to respond to you. And Larry, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I mean, Julie did most of this work. She's a very, like she said, it's a small organization. She did most of this herself. And we just did another meeting for GM1 gangliosidosis. And there was one, basically one, it's an all volunteer group. It's so rare. It's a mom. It's one mom that's the head of the organization. And we worked with her and tried to take as much, help her as much as we could along the way. So it is doable even with the small staff. But like Julie said, to try to do it on your own, it's a lot. It would be a lot to try to figure it out. There's a lot of steps, and we work with, to try to have a really good virtual meeting, you have to work with a company that can do the technical side of it. So anyway.
All right, we've got one last question from Brinley Brooks from HS Connect. Where do you suggest starting? What makes the biggest impact? We're not rare with HS, but are rarely talked about. I run my organization on the side and time is always a challenge. So thank you.
If you're choosing one listening session, well, Brinley, I'm not sure whether you want to talk about, if we're talking about listening session versus PFDD, I would choose PFDD. At the same time, you might want to send specific notes to the FDA saying, here is my disease, here is this disease, here are our burdens. How do you suggest we make an impact? How can we teach you more? They're going to say, do a listening session or a PFDD. And the thing, I'll go back to it. PFDDs give you a document in the public domain that is always there. And so, yes, it's more work, but the end result, it's a long-term investment in greater information on your burdens and unmet needs. Larry, do you have anything else there?
Yeah, and I just wanted to say too that if you want to know about next steps or what's involved, I had my email address as well. I could give you information about what are the next steps, how do you request it, how do you draft a letter of intent that you send to the FDA, what would be the budget, and then and then how to reach out to companies. As Julie said, these meetings are paid for almost 100% by the biopharma industry. So these aren't the patient organizations. It's not hurting their budget for the the most part, that they're getting funding. So
it's just the time, the personal work hours.
Right. It does take time. Yeah.
Definitely. Well, that wraps up our time. It's 2:59. This was fabulous. Thank you so much for all of your insight and your expertise and your experience. It's so helpful. And like Julie said, and Larry said too, reach out to them if you have questions that come up, if you're considering having your own listening session or PFDD, or want to learn about other ways to engage. The more we can raise that patient perspective, the better. And I think that we all realize that. So thanks everyone for being here, and hope you have a wonderful day.
Okay. Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.